Yesterday, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates by 25 basis points, something the market was widely expecting. But Fed Chair Jerome Powell here did something that he doesn't usually do. Take a listen to this clip.
The issue is that we have a large sector called non-housing service, core non-housing services, where we don't see disinflation yet.
Core non-housing services, or core services X housing. Powell would go on to mention that specific category 5 separate times during yesterday's Q&A. He's never done that before. Jerome Powell is known for making very vague, wishy-washy statements like bring down demand or data dependent or use our tools or, of course, transitory, but he's never called out one specific category of inflation and said we would like to see this specific category come down before we stop our rate hikes. He did that 5 times yesterday. So Jay Powell just specifically told the market these are the data points you need to watch in the upcoming inflation reports. So let's take a look at what core non-housing services inflation really means. First things first, core typically means no food and no energy. They strip out food and energy because they say it's too volatile and it doesn't make a really good indicator of what the economy is doing and what inflation is doing. So when you hear core, you think no food and no energy. And then, of course, non-housing, that's self-explanatory. Anything having to do with shelter, we're going to get rid of that. All right, so with that out of the way, let's take a look at the actual CPI math and see what core non-housing services inflation really are and what are those numbers doing. What we're looking at right here is the most recent CPI report for the month of December that was released a couple of weeks ago at the beginning of January. There is a link to this down in the description below if you want to check it out for yourself. What we're looking at is Table 2, the CPIU U.S. City Average by detailed expenditure category. This is when we break down these categories like food, like energy, into very specific items and track those things separately. So we're going to scroll way down past all of these goods products because we're talking about services here. So we got to go down almost 3/4 of the way through all of these categories until we get to the services. So here we are at the services less energy services, and this makes up a total of 57.469% of the whole CPI index. So services, it's a big chunk of the index. Now, the biggest chunk of that services index is going to be shelter, namely rent and owner's equivalent rent. But remember, we're talking about core non-housing services, so we can disregard that 32.9% for shelter. So let's scroll down a little bit more and look at what some of the other categories are that are contributing here. So here we've got medical care services. That's kind of a big one. It counts for 6.788% of the whole index. So this one has a pretty heavy weighting in the index. But if you look at this most recent year-over-year number, it's 4.1% year-over-year. Well, that's actually below the overall index, which came in at 6.5%. So while medical care services would fall under the category of Jay Powell's core non-housing services, this isn't really a problem right now because medical care services is lower than the index average. So this is not the data point that Jerome Powell is looking to come down before he lets up on his rate hikes. And likewise, we've got recreation services as a category here. This includes video, audio, cable, and satellite TV, all these other recreational things. Now that counts for about 3.147% of the index here. Again, that's a pretty big weight. But again, look at the latest year-over-year number at 5.7. The recreational services category is below the average of the overall index. So once again, I don't think it's the cost of recreational services that Jerome Powell is really worried about here. Even though at 5.7%, it is higher than his 2% target, it's still below the average of the index. So this is not one that's keeping Jerome Powell on this course of rate hikes. We've also got education and communication services, another big one at 5.316%. But look here, the latest year-over-year number is only 2.4%. That's actually right in line with Jerome Powell's goal. So education and communication services, yep, it fits into that category of non-housing core services, but it is not the problem that Jerome Powell is talking about here. The number's just too low. And we've got here other personal services, a 1.366%, but again, a most recent reading here of 5.5% inflation below the average of the index. So it's not really other personal services that he's worried about either. Which brings me to what I think is the specific data point that Jerome Powell is looking at when he says he wants to see core non-housing services come down. I think he's talking about transportation services. Now, the reason why I think that is besides the fact that transportation services counts for 6.018% of the index. That's the highest weighting in the category with the exception of medical care, but remember the medical care inflation wasn't really that bad. But take a look at this latest year-over-year number for inflation in transportation services, 14.6%. And at a 6% weighting in the overall index, that 14.6% inflation number for transportation services is enough to bring the whole index up higher. So I think Jerome Powell, when he said core non-housing inflation services, I think he was zeroing in on transportation services is what he needs to see coming down. So let's look at what makes up transportation services and see what might be causing these high numbers. We've got leased cars and trucks. We don't even have a most recent year-over-year number, so that's not it. Car and truck rental, nope, not at negative 4.9%. That's not causing this. Now we get to motor vehicle maintenance and repair. It's a 1% weighting in the index. And look at that, 13% year-over-year inflation for motor vehicle maintenance and repair. That is definitely one of the data points that Jerome Powell is watching right now because it's one of the highest inflation numbers in the index and it counts for a full 1% of the whole CPI equation. And if you want to know why used vehicle maintenance and repair is getting so expensive, look at this chart right here, folks. The average age of a car in the United States is currently 12.2 years old. Folks, we are driving some clunker jalopies in the United States these days. And you'll notice this trend. It's nothing new. New cars have been getting more expensive in the United States for years. It is out of control. Most people can't even afford a new car. And if they can, it's probably coming with a payment that's upwards of $1,000 a month. And of course, this is a trend that got much worse in 2021 and in last year because the price of a car went through the roof with the chip shortage and with the inventory shortage of new cars. That drove new car prices even higher. It also drove used car prices even higher. Not to mention new vehicles are getting more complex. That makes them more expensive to service. And as these more complex vehicles get older and older, the demand for repair services is getting higher and higher. Supply stays the same, demand goes up, price goes higher. So if Jerome Powell wants this 13% number to come down, either a whole bunch of Americans need to go out and buy new cars, or a whole bunch of Americans need to just give up on driving cars anyway so they don't place any additional demand on repair services, and then the repair costs would come down. This is starting to sound an awful lot like a Davos agenda, isn't it? The next one we've got here is motor vehicle insurance. It's 2.5% of the index, so it's an even higher weighting than repairs and servicing. And check out that number, 14.2% year-over-year inflation for motor vehicle insurance. So what's going on in the insurance industry? Well, I went to Value Penguin by LendingTree, and I got the state of auto insurance in 2023, and they're telling us that car insurance rates are expected to increase by 8.4% across the U.S. in 2023, amid an increase in drivers returning to the road as people are being called in back to the office at the end of the unfortunate medical situation. That means more cars on the road, more demand for driving, means more demand for auto insurance. Auto insurance's prices going higher. And that this is going to be the biggest jump in car insurance costs in the past 6 years. The average cost of full coverage car insurance across the U.S. is now $1,780 per year. And just to double check on that one, I went to progressive.com and took a look at what they're saying about why insurance rates are increasing. And I found a couple of interesting paragraphs here in this article. Repairing and replacing vehicles costs more. The auto industry has seen its share of labor shortages and supply chain disruptions over the past year. As the TechForce Foundation reports, the demand for transportation technicians outpaces supply by an estimated 5-to-1, leading to higher labor costs. Strained supply chains have also caused prices for auto parts and vehicles to spike dramatically. Altogether, these factors led to a 6.3% increase in the cost of vehicle repairs and maintenance, interesting, between February of 21 and February of 22, as well as a 41.2% spike in used vehicle prices, something we've talked about a lot on this channel. As repair costs go up, the amount insurers pay to fix their customers' vehicles also goes up. Likewise, as vehicle values rise, insurers pay more to help replace their customers' totaled cars and trucks, all of which increases the cost of auto insurance. But they're also saying here that accidents are increasing, leading to more claims. Changes in driving behavior are also impacting insurance rates. The number of car accidents has gone up, leading to more insurance claims. The higher claims value, coupled with higher vehicle repair and replacement costs, it's ultimately what's driving insurance rates up throughout the industry. So again, as we are being called back into the office, as more commuters are hitting the road, that unfortunate health situation is coming to a close. So we've got more cars on the road, causing more accidents, leading to more insurance claims to replace more expensive cars. So once again, I don't really see anything on the horizon that is going to suddenly lower this 14.2% increase in insurance costs. This one's actually going to get worse. Again, unless a huge swath of the population suddenly gives up their cars. Again, that sounds an awful lot like the agenda of the FEW backwards. Now, the last category in transportation I want to talk about here that's making a big difference appears to be public transportation, which makes up 0.91% of the index. It's still a pretty heavy value, but not as big as some of the other ones. But look at that one with an 18.9% year-over-year inflation rate. That's a really big one. And when we break down that category a little more, it's pretty obvious here that airline fares is responsible for the lion's share of this. It's 2/3 of the public transportation weighting at 0.63%. And look at that year-over-year number, 28.5% increase in airline fares. Now, you're probably right away thinking, all right, that's all jet fuel. And you're probably right. Jet fuel is playing a big role in that. But just to be sure, I did a little bit of research and I came across this article from just a couple of days ago over in the street about how American Airlines could hike their prices after Southwest's meltdown. But it was these few paragraphs that really jumped out at me. While increased demand can explain away some of the meteoric rise in prices, Americans are traveling a lot more because they were locked inside for 2 years and we're finally letting them out. But that doesn't explain why airline prices are easily outpacing inflation by 28.5%. The other part of the equation is that airlines are operating with about 15% less capacity than they were in 2019 after grounding parts of their fleets during the pandemic, according to Trip.com. Unless the economy goes into a much more serious recession than I expect, you're going to see that demand is going to outrun the supply of seats for all of 2023. Travel demand is actually higher than it was before, and there are a lot fewer seats to be sold to go in the air. So what happens is classic supply and demand, economics at work. There's intense demand, a shortage of supply, and something's got to give, and that's the airfares have got to go up a lot. So there you have it, folks. Jerome Powell told us yesterday exactly what he wants to see, but when you dissect the numbers, you can see that's actually pretty ugly for the average American. Jay Powell said he's not going to ease off on the brakes of the economy with his rate hikes until he sees a reduction in core non-housing services. And when you look at all the core non-housing services in the CPI, it's pretty obvious that transportation services is what's driving that category higher. And when you look in transportation services, the three big contributors to those higher numbers are automotive repairs and services, auto insurance, and airline fares. And so Jerome Powell is not going to stop crushing the economy until Americans start driving less and flying less. That's not dovish, folks. That's incredibly hawkish. Till next time, live small and dream big.